welcome to the second Fulhamish Stats Show, the show that translates all of Fulham's dealings on the pitch into small, bite-sized chunks for you to use as pub ammo with your mates. The last month has been tough for Fulham. We've fluctuated more than the pound after the Brexit vote. And to break it all down, I've got two guests with me. First things first, you may recognise this cheeky chappie from the podcast, but you also might recognise him from playoff final posters, various spots on BT Sport, but also turning a Real Madrid shirt into a Juventus shirt for Bleacher Report. It's Jack Collins.
Thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming on at such short notice.
No problem.
My second guest today has been through more tables than a carpenter trying to get prepared for today's show. It's George Singer.
Hello, hello.
How are you?
Yeah, very good. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you very much for coming on. I think we'll dive straight in with our first topic for today, which is going to be our midfield hub. It's Andre Frank, Zambo and Anguissa.
Easy for you to say.
Easy for me to say, harder for me to pronounce. Versus Kev McDonald in that hub of midfield. There's been a lot of chat recently about the two of them, how they compare, who's giving out the most attacking actions and who's giving out the most defensive actions and who's contributing to us more. So it'd be good to see, in your two opinion, backed up by stats, who's doing the best job in the hub of midfield.
Cool. Shall I go first?
Yeah,
so from my side, I don't think either have really impressed that much this season. Obviously, I think we all agree that McDonald's done a stellar job in the Championship. Obviously, the last stat show I was bigging up Anguissa, and he's let me down a bit. He's struggled a bit, I think, personally. So both of them, what we were really expecting from Anguissa was that high defensive output, loads of tackles, loads of interceptions, winning the ball back loads, and he's just not really doing it at the moment. So, he's averaging kind of a couple of tackles per 90, kind of about 1.5 interceptions per 90, which in the grand scheme of things is kind of under average. And, the kind of numbers he was getting, back in France were really kind of double that. So I guess looking back to how he performed, at the Arsenal game, I think he's still got a lot of work to bed into that squad. I think he's got, a lot more to do. From my side, I don't really see a standout between the two defensive midfielders at the moment.
So, Jack, you're a big fan of Zambo.
Yeah.
And you were basically Team Zambo for when he came in, and you've been basically flying the flag ever since. Obviously, as George says, he's round about half of what he was doing in Marseille on the output, but how does that sort of translate onto the pitch?
Yeah, obviously we've seen quite a lot of Zambo in fits and starts. We haven't yet seen him do 90 minutes, which is obviously something that you have to watch him bed in and all those kind of things. His stat output is better than McDonald's, not significantly, but it is better. He ranks higher for pretty much everything bar mistakes. So he ranks higher for tackles, interceptions, fouls more. And he, that his pass success rate, weirdly, is also higher than McDonald's, despite attempting far less passes. But I think what we're seeing is, and one of the things that's harder to measure in that regard is energy levels. And while, yes, we'll see here, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in a bit, he takes far more mistakes than Kevin McDonald does in terms of dispossession, losing the ball. But he also recovers differently. So, yeah, he commits far more fouls. But what we saw against Arsenal, for example, was when he loses the ball and therefore racks up a dispossession stat, he's in either to win it back or to make a foul. And a lot of us would rather the foul in that kind of area of the pitch where it's not necessarily dangerous than for someone to be bypassed completely, which is what happened when McDonald came on. So, it's translating those kind of figures into feasible concepts. You have to look at something like energy in terms of what he brings to the table, I suppose.
So I think the two main things we'll probably touch on here is his attacking output. This is Frank's attacking output that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
What sort of stats are we seeing from him in terms of key passes, for example, or forward passes, or just him trying to put Fulham on the front foot over the course of that 90 minutes?
So I think one thing that he does really well, and it's kind of maybe more of a sign of a box-to-box midfielder than a pure kind of anchorman defensive midfielder, is his dribbling. So averages over 2 dribbles per game, which is similar to what he did back in France. A really useful way of, if the operation are pressing high, quickly, dribble past the pressing player and move the ball, get into good space, free up the pressure, and move the ball on. So I think that's one thing he really gives in attack to the team.
Yeah, and translating that into what it affects is it stops us being pinned back as such, and the way that he adds that dynamism in midfield is probably best regarded by this stat. The more than 2 dribbles a game is a lot for someone who's supposed to be a defensive midfielder. I know we're going to talk to him more of a box to box and outputs in both ways, but for someone who came into this side kind of widely regarded as just a pure defensive midfielder, that ability to burst from deep, while it does cause Fulham problems in some ways in that we don't have a pure sitter, and especially if you're playing 4 at the back in our system, that makes a problem in some ways. But with 5 at the back, that's a really useful asset to have because it means that there's energy and dynamism in the midfield duo, which is what was been lacking in early games.
So when we talk about 5 at the back, are we discounting McDonald from being that other midfielder in there next to Seri? What sort of things are we looking at where it, but perhaps the argument for Kevin McDonald to be in there over Anguissa might not be as strong as the other way around, for example?
I think K-Mac won't work in that. It's the 2-man midfield. And what you found with the issue with the 2-man midfield is if you come against a team who have 3 in midfield, you're going to get overrun. They're going to have more people in there. So how do you combat that? And we saw obviously with Chelsea when they won the league a couple of years ago, they had Kante in the middle who was so energetic and moved around so much. He essentially acted as 2 midfielders, and that's what you need. You need someone who can run about and cover that extra man essentially. And we've seen kind of from the stats that we're looking at, he's got that energy. Him and Seri together have that dynamism, can act almost in that pivot way and run around, which McDonald just can't do anymore. So from my side, I really don't see McDonald working in that midfield too.
That's fair enough.
When McDonald was a sitter last season, we saw a lot of him dropping back into a back 3 and acting as kind of the third centre-back, especially when the 2 fullbacks bombed on. So that was kind of became part of his role. And with 3 at the back, you don't need that because obviously there's already a third person. And something that stood out to me in terms of the stats was that McDonald has 2.5 times more clearances per 90 than Anguissa has, and double the amount of long balls per 90. And that for me suggests someone who is relieving pressure. And if we are going to transition to this 5 at the back system, that's something that doesn't need to happen from there. And like we said, that dynamism, the ability to dribble out and all of those things is so, is negated by those kind of stats because that's not what Kevin McDonald does. So if we are transitioning into that kind of system, it doesn't necessarily suit the McDonald role.
Completely. And I think there's one more pressing argument in terms of a direct comparison between 2 players, and it's one that we touched on in the first ever stat show, and it's one that we'll look at again now we're 4 weeks down the line, but it's Bettinelli versus Fabry. Bettinelli has just, in this last Arsenal game, surpassed the amount of saves that Fabry made in the opening 2 games of the season, which feels unreal to me, but may make more sense to you guys. But I think the stat that we all look to when we're analysing a goalkeeper is their save percentage. How do they stack up, just very, very quickly? And if you were to make a call, one versus the other, who would you pick now and why? Obviously, we can have Sergio Rico in there. Performed very well against Millwall, but...
It was also against Millwall.
Yeah.
You can't really look at saves. It all depends on the attack. If you're against a team who don't shoot, you're not going to make any saves. That's where save percentage comes in, because it takes that into account. We can't really look at Fabry Zeta. He's only played 2 games for us.
2 games,
Correct me if I'm wrong. Yep, 2 games for us, and I think his save percentage was pretty good. It was around 70%, and Bettinelli so far 60 something percent. So the issues there is the sample size really. I've always thought Bettinelli's a good keeper. He was a good Championship keeper. I think he's an okay Premier League keeper, and that's what we're seeing in the numbers. I think we could do better, but then it comes back to everyone's talking about the language barrier with Fabry and Rico, so that's often quite hard to pull out in the stats, but in my opinion, if we can get around that language barrier, get Rico talking to the defence, get that communication going between the two, I'd be happy seeing Bettinelli phase out and one of the other guys in. I just think from their experience playing in the top leagues, having a better save percentage ratio, that's what I'd rather personally.
And Jack, just very quickly,
I don't think Marcus Bettinelli's done a whole lot wrong. I also don't think he's done a whole lot right. It is one of those things. He's saved most of the things I've expected him to save.
Yeah, completely.
He's not saved, much that I thought, oh, maybe he'll get to that. And, we'll speak about things like that second Lacazette goal at the weekend where he got a hand to it and he looked annoyed at himself, which is why you maybe look at that and go, oh, maybe he should have done better there. But aside from that, there's not too much. That said, when you're scrapping at the bottom of the table, you need your keeper to do you a favour sometimes and make those kind of stops and communicate well. I think we can put to bed, the argument that Fulham's defence was bad in the first games because of Fabri's communication skills, because it hasn't massively improved. So, there's something to be said there that we can build from that now. Whether that is, over the international break when they get some time together to sit in and tuck in, we will see.
Okay, cool. So we'll keep it with the defence, and we're gonna concentrate on someone here that has been in quite a lot of slack, and has had quite a lot of abuse held their way over the last few games, and that's Dennis Odoi, who was a linchpin of our defence as we came up through the playoffs last season. He impressed on a number of occasions and had a formidable partnership with Tim Ream, but since we've been in the Premier League, his mistakes that he seems to have, his certain rashness, his tendency to give away penalties and bad decisions seems to be coming to the forefront a little bit more. On the basis of it, it looks like he should be making quite a lot of mistakes and we should be paying for it. Is that necessarily true, though? Or is Dennis doing himself justice by being able to get out of those positions?
Yes, so I think this is where the stats can be quite interesting because they show you things that you maybe wouldn't expect.
Yep.
I guess the key thing with defensive stats is you've always got to take them with a pinch of salt, and also fundamentally a defensive stat is quite a weird thing to have, because obviously when you're attacking, your role is to make things happen, so passes, shots, etc. When you're a defender, your role is to stop things happening. So you might make 2 times more tackles compared to another player, but is that because you're letting them come closer? Is that because you should be pressuring them to make them lose the ball and not even need to make a tackle? So there's always issues with using defensive stats, but if you combine lots together, average per 90 and things like that, you can start to paint a bit of a picture. So again, slight issue with sample size. So all the defenders, like we said, we've pretty much hit every combination of defenders. So the sample size is quite small. But of the defenders you've got, so from a defensive output side, so tackles, interceptions, blocks, etc., Odoi is one of the lowest of the various centre-backs we've got. Yep. He does pass a lot, though. So of all the centre-backs, the second most passes. And unbelievably, the joint fewest errors, which really surprised me because I was fully expecting him to be one of the worst ones there. Again, it depends how you categorise error in the stats, but...
So, like you say, it depends how you categorise errors in the stats. How do they do that? What's the methodology behind it? Sorry to put you on the spot.
So these stats will be collated normally by Opta. So Opta are the main set of people who collate them, and then all your who scored, scorer, etc. will use that data. The data will be, those kind of data points will be gathered by basically people watching football. So you'll get someone watching a game of football who will manually attribute what happens there. And then the issue you get is there can be some kind of subjectivity. So for something like an error, it can be due to whoever happens to be watching that game. Obviously, there's steps they put in place to try and reduce that, but I guess you've got to be careful with those kind of subjective stats there.
So essentially, I would put double the mistakes for Odoi than you would?
Potentially, and that's where maybe a bit of bias comes in.
I'm sorry to offend Guy Barlow here, but I certainly would. Jack, your thoughts on Odoi?
Something that interested me was the fact that Mawson, Chambers and Le Marchand have all had an error leading to a shot, including a goal. One of them led to a goal, Le Marchand's led to a goal, the other two were just shots on target. Odoi has none. There's no direct errors leading to goals. But
so what does that tell us?
Well, it tells us that maybe he gives the ball away in slightly less risky positions
or
than
that
the
his
others.
decision making slightly better than
the
others?
That can. It depends very much how you look at it. If Odoi goes on a wander and loses the ball, halfway through the opposition centre half, the chances are there's going to be more passes, more phases of play before it gets back to the Fulham goal, which therefore might be like, okay, that's not a direct error from Odoi that's led to a goal. Whereas Lamarchand's pass against Burnley, for example,
Yeah.
led directly to the goal, and that's why he's down as having, led directly to that. So,
Completely.
but, you look at the start of the Watford game, and no one's attributed that error. If anyone, I think it might be down to Seri, but even then, I think that's a little bit up in the air as opposed to having a direct kind of culprit for it. But we could all say that Chambers and Mawson were equally at fault for that because there was just no communication between the back three. So those haven't come into play, things like that. It's just direct errors. And so that does speak for Odoi. But in terms of George was saying his defensive actions, he's got very poor kind of overall stats. Interestingly, Maxime Lemarchand came out on top of everything pretty much.
Really?
Oh, George has the same thing. So there
Sting me too.
I found,
Damn
it's so nice that you guys have found a rhythm so quickly.
I know, we've just slotted in here as a centre-back pairing, unlike any of the Fulhamists.
Almost Jarman and Monk-esque in that.
Yeah, exactly. So, that was interesting for me to find that, Lemarchand's stats are so good compared to everyone else's. But, again, it's not necessarily, given that he's the only one that's given up a direct error to a goal, you can't look at that as the be-all and end-all. But it's interesting to look at.
So I think in terms of having direct errors that have led to goal, it correlates nicely, and obviously correlation being the stat show is a lovely way to move straight on to our next point, which will be Fulham have given up the most shots in the Premier League at the moment and have let in the most goals, 21. If we carry on this trend, we are on course to set a record for the most amount of goals conceded in this season ever by any team.
It's pretty impressive.
Has anyone kept up this level of performance and stayed in the Premier League?
No.
In short, no, I'm guessing.
Well, no. So shots per game and goals per game conceded, no one's even hit the level we're at the moment. Agreed. We've got a small sample size, and as we play more, as we play some of the weaker teams, look, that's going to come down. I think the interesting thing going through, so I looked at this time last year, so what teams were in similar positions to us. The two that stood out were Palace and Leicester. So obviously Palace had the really tough start to the season.
No wins from 7.
No
goals
wins
scored
from
in 7.
And then Leicester had all the issues. Claude Puel was under a lot of pressure very early on, and they managed to turn it round.
Yep.
And interestingly, looking at the teams who went down, for instance, West Brom at this time last year had a really great defensive record, and I think that's partly they did still have Pulis this time
they did.
last season. I think that's a large part to it. So I think it's definitely too early to read too much into it, but we've got a lot of time to turn it around, like a lot of teams did last year.
I think it's it's obviously interesting to look at this point. And yes, no one has ever, if we were to carry on like this, we would be setting records. And I think if you're setting records for goals conceded, it's going to be tough. Even if you play a kind of Keegan-esque will score more than you kind of territory, there, you have to be very, very good to pull that kind of thing off. And while we have an excellent squad on paper and there is a lot of talent there undoubtedly, I don't know if we're conceptually good enough to pull that kind of thing off for an entire season. It's just interesting, I think, to look at this, and we've only faced the third most shots. We faced the most shots on target, but only the third most shots. Brighton and Burnley have conceded more shots than us. But considering we're letting people in and around dangerous areas in order to have those shots, something needs tightening up pretty sharpish.
Well, interesting that you say Brighton and Burnley have faced the most shots in the Premier League. Arguably, their calibre of keeper is very, very good. You've got Matt Ryan there, who's the Australian national team goalkeeper. And you've got Joe Hart, who, despite everyone's flack
he's turned it
towards
around
him,
this season.
has done very, very well this
very
season.
good.
And once you put trust in someone like Joe Hart, he will perform. I think could this be a difference maker between us and the likes of Brighton, Burnley, potentially the likes of Bournemouth, maybe like Huddersfield, for example?
Yeah.
Burnley have witchcraft going on. I'm sure there's something Dyche is doing over there. The data that they had last year, again, one of the most shots conceded, yet the fewest goals. So many blocked shots. There's something magical going on there. I don't know what Dyche is doing. It's probably not legal, but yeah, he's doing some great stuff there. I think from my side, the really worrying stuff is, so from looking at, so I looked at some of the stepping back a bit data. So entries into 18. So how many times have the opposition broken your 18-yard line, so i.e. the edge of the penalty box? We're the second worst in the league for that per game.
Behind?
West Ham.
Well, that doesn't surprise me.
Then for shots conceded, like we're one of the worst there. Expected goals per shot, i.e. on average,
where are these shots coming from?
Yeah, we're the worst in the league. So
we're giving them too many high value chances in and around our box.
Yeah.
Every single game, which is what we touched on in the first stat show, when we basically backed up the fact that Fulham were giving up way too many high value chances early in the first 4 games to even think about surviving in this league.
Yeah.
And we're still doing it even now after the international break. It's quite worrying, really, isn't it?
It really is. And you couple those together, if we're conceding loads of shots and they're all great quality shots, there's no surprise we're conceding the most per game. And to me, we've spoken a lot about particular players, centre-backs, spoken a bit about Anguissa. To me, this isn't an issue with a single player. This is an issue with the system.
Yeah.
There's clearly not enough focus going on, in defensive systems, actions. There's got to be something around the team and the players all switching around that must have an impact.
Yeah.
But clearly, there's something we need to do better here.
And from your point of view, Jack?
Yeah, there's something obviously to be said for the fact that Stuart Gray's departure and how this all ties in, because you look at us last year, we weren't defensively cohesive by any stretch of imagination, especially early on in the season, but we were better than this.
Yeah.
We weren't, we gave away a lot of goals at late in games early on, if you remember, and those things, but we weren't just conceding at will, apart from maybe that Bristol City game where they could have put 10 past us.
Yeah.
That was really one of the only times where you were like, okay, they could just score as many as they want here. And there have been a lot of times this season, every time a team came forward, they looked like they were going to score, and the data backs it up, which is obviously reassuring in some senses, because it means that we're not going mad, but it's very disheartening in other senses, because this needs sorting fast. It goes back to system. It goes back to Slivica. He needs to decide on his best system very quickly.
Yeah.
He needs to decide on his best, back 5 or back 4, whatever it is, very quickly, because once those pieces are in place, it becomes easier to then work on the organisational side of it.
Yeah.
But I do think that a lot of this needs to be backed up with the fact that we need some sort of defensive specialist in the club.
Completely.
And
Definitely.
it makes absolutely no surprise to me that since the departure of Stuart Gray, our defence has lost its cohesion.
Yeah. You spoke a lot about identity in that previous segment. And I think something that comes onto that quite nicely is Fulham do have this identity to always want to play it where possible, to play it out the back, to play through the thirds.
Yeah.
And not many other Premier League teams do that and take the risks that we do. One notably is probably Wolves. You obviously have the two sides at the top of the league this year, which are Man City and Liverpool, and you're starting to see Chelsea implement that kind of style as well. How do we compare as a defensive unit versus other teams in and around us, in and around the Premier League, in terms of passing statistics? Is it something that could potentially hinder us across the rest of the season, and should we be looking to go a little bit more direct in these next few games?
In terms of going just a little bit more broad to begin with, because I know George has the deep dive on the defensive stats, we have the most passes of any team outside the top 6 in general.
Yeah.
So that's obviously shows that continuation of style has been backed up by the statistics, and more than the likes of Wolves, who actually are surprisingly low down the list behind the likes of Leicester and that. So we've tried to translate that into thing, and we've also, in terms of going forward, had more shots than pretty much any of those teams, which is interesting because we have tried to work the ball into areas. So
could this basically mean that Wolves' direct style of attacking play, obviously you say they've got less passes, clearly means that they're focusing a lot more on the transitions, which is something that's under Nuno and under a Portuguese coach has always been at the forefront of the way they play.
Yeah, of course.
Is that how it translates on the pitch?
You remember Andre Villas-Boas at Chelsea, and then even more so at Tottenham, and became that kind of pressing through the transition style, and the kind of transition idea that's kind of been a little bit broken up by the likes of Klopp and co, because that phase doesn't necessarily exist anymore. But that was obviously Mourinho's first priority when he came in at first, and Villas-Boas was obviously his kind of protege. Although they were very different in terms of the way that they actually played, that Portuguese nature to look at the transition as the most important phase of play has always kind of come across. And yes, you see that in Nuno's teams. They defend very well, and that's something that can't be underestimated. They've kept that kind of back 4 very similar to what it was very similar to what it was last year, and from there they've learned that kind of direct style. The wing backs are so prominent in their system, and that's a very, very common trait of a transitional side. And so if you look at that coming back to us, we need to decide what we are very quickly, and the first part of that works on how the defensive passing statistics work out, and I imagine George can go further into depth.
Segues me lovely.
Yeah,
absolutely. So looking at really simply, passes per 90 minutes for defenders. So looking at all the defenders across the Premier League, how many passes they make per 90. So as you'd expect, Liverpool and City players are all at the top. I think the top 5 are Man City and Van Dijk's in there or something.
Otamendi had the most passes in the whole of the Premier League last year.
Exactly, and that's because they play
like 100% passing success rate,
or 2 meters to company to the right of him, whatever. And yeah, so looking, it's all those big names. The top non-Big Four players, so non-City, Liverpool, Man City, Tottenham, whatever, is Le Marchand, and all 5 of our centre backs are in the top 25. So we're in the top 5 passing defensive teams, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
So it's clearly the system. It's clearly we've brought in the kind of players who want to do that. For instance, Le Marchand, it's a similar numbers to what he hit in France the previous season. So, it's definitely what the recruitment guys are looking for there.
Yep.
And I think, I'm sure we'll maybe touch on it a bit later, but it's generating into those attacks. We're creating a fair amount of shots. I guess the Premier League's a bit weird in that the top 6 are so far ahead that sometimes it's best just to get rid of them.
The mini league.
And look at how we best of the rest. And we're pretty good in the best of the rest. So from an attacking side, I think it works. I think it generates the chances. Yeah, we could do better. And I think there's definitely things we could learn from Wolves, who, I love the way they're attacking this year. The issue is, and we've spoken about it before, it's those defensive errors. If you pass loads between the centre-backs, if you get it wrong, you've given them a one-on-one chance. We've seen that 3, 4, 5 times this season already. So there's definite upsides, but we do have to live with that risk. And it's definitely, I think, as the centre-backs play more together, they'll be more in tune and less likely to make those mistakes.
Definitely.
Yep. A final point here is someone that we did touch on again in the first ever stats show. Someone that's had really glowing review from a large part of our fan base, and has had a more prominent role in Fulham's last 4 fixtures, more so than he did in the previous 4, and that's the Argentinian wing wizard, Luciano Vietto. I can see what he sort of does on the pitch. He likes to take it away from the play in very tight spaces. He likes to try and expose space on the wings. He tries to run at people. He's really good in those tight, nickety little spaces.
Yep.
Just in front of the back 4, where we need him to take the ball and run with it, and he does that really well. What else does he do? What other impacts does he have on our team? And from an attacking output, is he really going to elevate us to the level we need to be to survive in this league?
I like him. He's got the joint most assists in the league, obviously, which are helped by those 2 against Burnley, where one of them was the pass to Seri before a wonder goal. So, he has the joint most assists in the league with 4. He's also by far our most creative player. He's averaged 2.6.
How are you defining that? Sorry.
Well, he's averaged 2.6 chances created per 90 minutes.
Yeah.
Which is, of players to have featured in 7 games or more, he's ahead of the likes of Sterling, Salah, Sane and Pogba. He's only behind, sort of the likes of Ryan Fraser, who's been on fire this season, Gylfi Sigurdsson, Willian, and Gabby Jesus and Eden Hazard.
So we can expect that someone will come in for Vietto around about January and give us, 50 mil?
Apart from he's on loan.
On loan.
Cheers for that. Move on.
But yeah, look, he's been very, very good in a creative sense, and especially given the fact that we needed someone necessarily to step up in the absence of Kearney. He's actually filled that gap quite nicely.
Okay.
I don't think they're similar players by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't think that...
No, don't come for the king.
I think they could play together very nicely.
Yeah.
But in Kearney's absence, and especially because a lot of us thought it was going to be Jean-Michel Seri that stepped up, it's actually been Vietto that's been creating, and he did it again this weekend. He does have the tendency to occasionally go missing. His defensive work rate is weirdly high for someone who a lot of people say doesn't track back. But he has, in the second half of games, especially in the likes of the Arsenal game, just faded out of contention, and there are moments. But in general, I think he's been absolutely fantastic for us.
George?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is comparing this season Vietto to kind of looking back at, was it kind of 14-15
Villarreal season.
Villarreal season
Vietto,
where he absolutely smashed in the goals, and comparing the two, if you get their attacking radar up, we love our radars here, attacking radars up, comparing the two, he's a completely different player now compared to what he was when back in that season, playing a lot more as the striker, a lot higher up the pitch, generating a lot more shots, a lot more goals, and really acting more as a finisher rather than a playmaker. And definitely what we're seeing this year, slightly more reserved role, out on the wing, being a lot more creative, making far more passes. We've spoken about getting loads of assists. I think it's unlikely he'll keep it up from an expected assist side. He's around 2 compared to 5 assists, so we'd expect it's unlikely he's going to continue assisting at this level. But he's still, giving a lot to the side. We've spoken about kind of key passes and things like that, averaging kind of a dribble a game, which is pretty good again. So I think he offers a lot to the team. But yeah, definitely a different kind of player. So I don't think, it's probably got an awful lot to do to where Slav's playing him, but it definitely feels like a different Vieto to one of 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, so when you said he's a different Vieto to 3 or 4 years ago, under then he was playing for Marcelino's Villarreal.
Yeah.
And Marcelino has a massive tendency just to play a flat 4-4-2. And you see that now with his Valencia squad, and they're very direct and they like to get the ball up to forwards really quickly, which is why Vieto has had such a big impact for that Villarreal side. I remember him turning Diogo Godin inside out for a wonderful goal when they beat Atletico. And it doesn't often happen to a defender like Godin. He does have pedigree. He's such a good player.
Yeah.
I think if we got him nearer Mitrovic, he hugs the wing quite a little bit.
Yeah.
If we got him nearer Mitrovic, we could see the best come out of him once again.
I was going to say, I was actually going to ask you, I thought when Tom Cairney comes back into the system, if we persist with the 5 at the back and we go to 3 in the middle, seeing Vieto off Mitrovic might see more of a return to that kind of ruthless side. The only thing that concerns me slightly about that is his chance conversion rate is very, very low. Obviously, he hasn't scored, but more than that, he's had some big chances in a couple of moments. He's got 3 on goal a couple of times and hasn't even massively tested the keeper.
Well,
and
the one that comes to mind is Everton.
Of course. Well, the one that came to mind for me was the first one against Watford, where he was put through on goal by Andre Schürrle and one-on-one. And you expect someone who has been turned from a striker into a more reserved player to be absolutely feeding off that. That's bread and butter to an actual striker, and someone of Vieto's calibre in that 14-15 season where he was just unstoppable and unplayable at times. You'd expect that to be sort of bread and butter for him. So if he is to move forward and back into that position behind Mitrovic, then I'd expect to see him hope to increase his output. Otherwise, he's going to be very difficult to justify an inclusion over someone like Schürrle, who, while is quite wild with his shots, does seem to put them away a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, Schürrle averages, I think, the 3rd most shots per game so far this season, with Mitrovic 2nd. So we're generating loads of shots. That's the issue that I'd have with if we are going to a 2 up front system. I think Schürrle's done enough to guarantee his place for a bit. I think it would be harsh to get rid of him. I guess it's a nice problem for Slav to have, too many players for the system. So we got lots of games. We'll have to rotate around. At the moment, of the 2, I think Schürrle's done more, personally. I think he's offering more, particularly, in attack. He's got his shooting boots on. If of the 2 I had to drop one, I'd drop Vieto. But I still quite like the front 3 of those 3 together.
I would go the other way.
Oh, would you?
I would.
Okay.
I like... it's not about... I just think that Schürrle shoots a lot when shots aren't on. And I imagine the data will back me up there. There are a lot of shots where Schürrle will go... He'll look at it and they'll be like, oh, there's only 3 players in front of me. Maybe I'll squeeze it through the gap. And when he gets into
he does
those...
that. He has squeezed it through the gap.
Once he gets it into those one-on-one positions, I think Schürrle's deadly. But he often doesn't look for the pass when he needs one, and that's
the only difference.
Oh no,
you don't win the lottery.
And Vieto hasn't been shooting enough for my liking. But I think that if we got him into that position closer to Mitrovic, then I think his output would increase. And I think Schürrle's a wonderful player to have around the place, and I think that he will feature heavily. And I think that if it was to happen tomorrow, Slav would put Schürrle in ahead of Vieto. But right now, I think that creativity behind Mitrovic and that ability to sort of slip him in maybe occasionally, as opposed to having a go, might actually fall in Vieto's favour.
And I think, with a few potentially easier games coming up, it's going to be a lot easier for Vieto to get chances against Cardiff than it is Arsenal. So hopefully we'll see some of those chances come through and him pushing a bit further forward.
Getting off the mark, maybe.
Absolutely.
Guys, I'd like to say thank you very much for you both coming on today. You had some incredible points, and I hope all of our viewers that watch this video will really, really like it. We'll take it into the pub, absolutely beast their mates over a few pints, and then they'll watch Stats Show episode 3, when it comes back. That'll be in around about a month's time. We like to keep it in a sample of around about 4 or 5 games to give you the best and most in-depth insights we possibly can. So Jack, thanks for taking time out of your hectic schedule across all major broadcasts to come on Fulhamish Stat Show.
Thank you very much for having me, Benjamin.
And George, thank you very much for coming in, providing all the info you could ever need to smash your mates.
Thank you, Ben.
Cheers, and thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in a few weeks. Goodbye.
Cheers.